These are symbols of the four Gospels. As we noted in a previous vid, two of these four are frequently questioned in terms of their authorship. It's time we had a look at one of them. Matthew is unique in this respect, because it's the one New Testament book that has any issues whatsoever in terms of internal evidence of attestation. The problem is that our earliest copy of Matthew, a 3rd century manuscript designated P1, doesn't ascribe authorship to anyone. The reason this isn't a big deal is because P1 likely had its origins in a scroll copy of Matthew, where the authorship would be designated by an external tag. Now, perhaps if P1 stood alone without the additional evidence we're going to discuss, it might make for a persuasive point against Matthean authorship, but it's far from the only evidence in play. When it comes to external evidence of attestation, Matthew turns out to be a goldmine, and we have testimony that predates the copy called P1. Here's a list of church authors that affirm that Matthew authored a gospel. Now, one interesting point which is relevant is that when we collect this testimony, we find that it was believed that the Matthew we have in Greek was derived from another document that was in one of the native languages of Palestine, either Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, some may object that Greek Matthew shows no signs of having been translated from one of those Palestinian languages, but that's not necessarily true. Some scholars, like the Greek specialist Daniel Wallace, say that they find traces of those languages in Matthew's Greek. But even if Wallace is wrong, a writer who was very proficient in Greek, like the Jewish historian Josephus, didn't necessarily leave any signs of having translated his source material. If Matthew is a tax collector, as his own gospel indicates, then he would have been likely a very proficient bilingual. So even if his Greek doesn't look translated, that doesn't mean his original text wasn't written in Hebrew or Aramaic. There are a few internal clues for Matthew's authorship, but those that I find the strongest are the ones that confirm that his gospel is the product of someone just as we describe Matthew to be, a former tax collector who also has extensive training in the Jewish religion. First, Matthew more frequently references money than any other gospel, and uses unique monetary terms not found in the synoptic parallel accounts. That means he's either a nerd, or an accountant, or, well, a tax collector. Second, based on information in the Gospels, Matthew's original name was Levi, which in turn indicates that he was by ancestry a member of the priestly tribe of Levi. Normally such a person would have a proper Jewish religious training, and Matthew's Gospel shows evidence of this in the way he makes use of the Old Testament and the way he deals with issues related to Judaism. But here's the catch. There would be only so many jobs available for a trained Levite, and someone like Matthew might be forced to seek employment elsewhere. Given his educational level, one possible job for such a person would be tax collector. And in line with that, Matthew's Gospel also indicates someone who is a Hellenized Jew, one influenced by Greek style and society. That's some pretty good internal evidence, better than we have for many ancient documents. But now let's look at a couple of the best internal arguments against Matthew's authorship. Many of these arguments broadly follow an outline like this. Some element in Matthew could only have been written after 70 AD. The historical Matthew would have been dead by 70 AD. Therefore, he could not have written the gospel with his name on it. Chief in these arguments, and one often used to date all the Gospels late, is that Matthew has Jesus showing knowledge of the war against Rome in AD 70. Now obviously only a denial of predictive prophecy lies behind such arguments. Once this barrier is cleared, these additional points can be made which diffuse charges of prophecy written after the fact. First, the context of Jesus' statements indicates the time before the temple was destroyed. Passages in the Gospels refer to the temple in present tense, or in a very casual way that suggests that it is still standing. The story of the fish and the coin in particular would have been irrelevant once the temple had been destroyed, and indeed highly problematic, since after 70 the temple tax went to support the pagan temple of Jupiter in Rome. Second, a prediction of the destruction of the temple is hardly unique. Destruction of the temple, or of Jerusalem, would not be too wild a guess, in light of how turbulent relations with the Romans were in Jesus' time. Several contemporaries of Jesus made similar predictions. The most familiar of these predictors, mentioned by Josephus, was Jesus the son of Ananias, a bit of a madman who made predictions of the temple's destruction between 63 and 70 AD. Prior to Jesus' time, there were also predictions of the temple being destroyed found in the Old Testament, and in the intertestamental book of 2nd Maccabees. It just didn't take much to see those events coming, any more than it took prophetic genius for the American politician John Calhoun to see in 1847 that conditions in the USA were such that the result might someday be civil war. So just because Matthew records Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple, that doesn't mean we have to date his gospel after 70, and therefore also deny Matthew his gospel. There are a few other lesser arguments to date Matthew late, but we'll just pick one in particular as typical of what can be found, in that it's pretty weak and nitpicky. In Matthew 27:8 and 28:15, Matthew refers to conditions in 30 AD or so that are still as they are to this day. Some critics suggest that this means a late date. But how long can we wait before saying to this day? Wouldn't 30 years, meaning a 60 AD date for Matthew, be sufficient? Or even 20 years, which would be a 50 AD date? Right now we're only 22 years past the destruction of the Berlin Wall. And would it be wrong to say that it remains destroyed to this day? So that's what I'd say are two of the best arguments made against Matthew's gospel being by Matthew. There are others, but they're pretty bad. And you can see some of those dealt with in materials linked to in the vid description. See you next time.